Hello, everyone. My name is Winfred, and I work here at Akiva as a growth marketing lead. And in today's webinar, we shall discuss the process of using what if scenarios to improve forecasts for new products addition. Our presenter today is Abhishek, and he's the product manager here, the project manager here at Akiva. Abhishek, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. This is Abhishek. I'm a project manager at Arkiva, and I've worked with multiple clients in the manufacturing and CPG industry. So I'm happy to share some of my insights for using what-if scenarios to improve forecasts for new products. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Abhishek. But before we get started, I'd like to mention that if at any point in time you have trouble hearing us, please let us know by using the chat feature in the GoToWebinar window, and we will be sure to assist you. Also, we'll reserve a few minutes at the end of the webinar for questions. So please feel free to enter your questions as you think of them using the GoToWebinar questions window. We hope you can take a few minutes at the end of the webinar to complete our feedback survey so we can ensure that you get the most out of our webinar. Next slide, please. So before we get into the whole weeds of today's discussion, I would like to take a brief moment to give you an overview of Akiva. Next. So at Akiva, we believe that improved business performance starts with better planning. And how do we do this? Next slide, please. And as a result, your Akiva team has only one goal in mind, which is to ensure you achieve your better planning goals without forcing you to fit a software mode, which is great. And as a result, we celebrate your unique business processes. This gives you the power to keep your business processes intact so you don't change the way you perform your business functions on a day-to-day basis, but rather we model our solution to fit your business. And so we start every Akiva solution creation process with just one question and only one question in mind. And that question is, how can we empower you with a better planning process? So our goal here at Akiva is to put you in the driver's seat to steer your improved business performance goals. So I am going to give you a quick overview of all the cool solutions that we have here at Akiva that can fit into, that can help your business improve its performance goals. Next slide, please. So I want to give you a quick overview of our full suite one plan S&OP solution. So our solution is used today by over 17,000 users worldwide in process and chemical, food and beverage, consumer packaged goods, and discrete industries around the globe to plan supply chain operations for product revenues of over $50 billion. So over the years, we have expanded our reach, and Akiva is now a global supply chain planning software provider with offices in North America, Europe, and Asia. So in order to do this, we define One Plan S&OP as an integrated demand-driven sales and operations planning process for dynamic businesses. And this starts with integrated financial planning and real-time demand planning with optimized inventory management system, as well as demand and supply synergy, continuous capacity planning, and dynamic S&OP monitoring, visualization, and execution module as well. So in today's webinar, uh, we are going to concentrate on what if, which is going to help you to plan your demand. And this is also part of the real-time demand planning module. Next slide, please. So our discussion topic is what if, and I want to provide a quick definition of what if process. So what if is a collaborative process to evaluate the differences between alternatives and come up with a consensus on which plan is better. Okay. And so the what if solution that we have here at Akiva gives you the power to evaluate and to create different scenarios around your supply chain that you can use as a basis to have an informed and insightful discussion with your upper management on the best way to enhance your supply chain process. So on the next slide, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the different features that the what if solution here at Akiva encompasses. First, it starts with scenario manager to find the results for different scenarios, and also you are able to configure the module structure by easily changing constraints, not just changing them, but also doing them quickly, so that when markets change, when economic situations change, you can make those quick tweaks to help you always get ahead of the curve. It also has the integrated scenario reporting and presentation. And so once you put a report, it gets you straight into the presentation slides, and boom, you can send it out to your upper management to have a quick discussion with them on the best scenario to really optimize your supply chain by. And so in today's agenda, Abhishek is going to walk you through all the cool things that he's going to discuss with you. He's going to show you the various ways that you can start the whole process of creating a what if scenario for new products. And so I'm going to open up the next slide for Abhishek to quickly lead us in this discussion. Please carry on, Abhishek.
Yep. Thank you very much, Winfred. Again, welcome to the webinar. And I want to start off with the agenda for today and the things that I'm going to discuss. So as part of this what if scenarios and how we can use to forecast demand for new products, I would like to start off with a little bit of introduction of why we are doing that, and then kind of get into what exactly or what are some options or scenarios which cause the change in demand, and then get into how do you forecast the new products. And then I also want to end the presentation with a couple of slides on coronavirus and the different what if scenarios at a high level that you can go through. We planned this webinar around the time when there was a demand surge for Popeye chicken sandwich. So some of the insights are derived from that and are applicable specifically to the CPG industries or consumer packaged goods, and for new products or new product introduction. So if you have existing products also which might have a surge in demand, some of the points that I'm going to discuss would be applicable, but most of them I think would be applicable or more apt to the new products. So we'll discuss about the traditional ways in which the new products have been getting forecasted, some of the updates that we are trying to suggest, and then we'll do some what if analysis around that. So as part of introduction, what I want to start off with is just stating why do we do what if analysis. Of course, we have because in the supply chain world, we have a lot of contingencies in both the demand part of the supply chain as well as the supply part of the supply chain process. And because of these big events, for example, Brexit or coronavirus or the Popeye chicken sandwich, which had quite a lot of surge in demand, all of these scenarios, they had some sort or they have some sort of supply or demand contingencies, and what if thinking they apply to any of these big events, and not just big events, also any of the small events that might impact your supply chain. Because regular supply chain, it becomes sort of an habit, and habit is a good thing because it adds reliability into your supply chain. But being able to step out from that habit, we have to make sure we think of all the contingencies ahead of the time, so that if a particular event occurs, we are able to respond to it in a more intelligent way. One of the very good example would be about firefighters or SWAT teams who practice for some of the rare events. They hope they don't happen, but when they happen, they are well prepared for it because they've already practiced for it, or at least have gone through the action plan for those rare events. So with that in mind, let's first look at some of the causes of increase or decrease in the demand. Now, as we said, it can happen to any of your new products or existing products. We want to see what are the high level ways in which the increase or decrease in demand happen. So sometimes it's more of like a reason based thinking where, so for example, in the more recent scenario of coronavirus, when the government says don't go out or clean up or make sure you are sanitizing things or surfaces, then the demand for all the sanitizing products go up, or the demand for TV dinner go up because you're not going out, so you're planning to maybe order in the food since you cannot go out and eat in the restaurants. Or in the coronavirus case where people are getting sick, the demand for medical supplies and oxygen, it goes up. And sometimes in the CPG industry, like food or fashion, it might be a taste or preference based. So, well, people might just love the taste of the food that they are eating, and that might just drive the demand up. Sometimes the demand can also be manufactured, as in case of the advertisements that go out for your product. So in some cases, it might also lead to an increase in demand. But a couple of more important topics that I want to talk about is going viral. So if I go back to my Popeye chicken sandwich example, be it the tweet exchange between the companies, but some of the users got hold of it and maybe they just loved the taste of it, that it just so happened that somebody did a positive tweet about it, and before they knew, the demand just went off the roof. And that of course happens because we are all well connected now with a lot of other people, and that gets the word out at a much greater pace as compared to before in advertisements that used to happen through either newspapers or televisions. Now we are connected. One person is connected to maybe 300 or 500 people, and even they are connected to other 300 or 500 people. So the word just goes out exponentially, and that's what going viral is one of the things that we are seeing causes a great fluctuations in demand. And in case of Popeye chicken sandwich, what we saw that once it started going viral, people just started or kept talking about it, and at some point it reached this tipping point where the demand just went off the roof and it was just not manageable, and that caused a lot of shortages for the sandwich business that they were in, and there were long queues and unsatisfied customers. And Popeye chicken sandwich, for some reason, they did not have enough contingencies in place. They had some contingencies, and we'll look into it a little bit further in the next few slides. But just so you know that you can do all the analysis based on the market. You can because the demand increases in different in different categories. It can be reason-based thinking, or it can be taste or preference-based. One thing you could do is that you can do some sort of market-based analysis or focus groups, and you can maybe come up with a scenario that what will you do in 20% increase in demand. But it just so happens in today's world that somebody does a positive tweet and then market goes up by 100%. So how do you deal with those sort of scenarios? So we'll look into that in subsequent slides. So when we were talking about Popeye chicken sandwich, there are some of the traditional ways in which we forecast the demand for new products. And in those traditional ways, the questions that we ask to begin with are that whether these products are similar to the ones that we have sold before, and what was the customer response back then, or is competition selling any other similar type of products, and how much do they sell, and based on that how much market share we can think of capturing, and what are some of the profiles that these types of products follow in our industry. and try to come up with a baseline forecast based on these questions. These are not just the only questions, but in traditional ways where we are trying to forecast new products, then these are some of the questions that we start off with when we are trying to forecast. And the typical process that we follow, in some cases, for example, we do a customer research or market research where we see what the competition is doing, how much is the customer demand for similar products. So focus group is what I'm referring to. So there is a very good example that back in the day, I think around 1980s or 85, Coca-Cola was seeing a lot of competition from Pepsi, and they did a similar focus group study where they found out that people prefer the Pepsi drink because it is a little bit more sweeter in taste. And based on that, Coca-Cola came up with this product called New Coke, and it did not go well for them. It was kind of a total bust. So they had to go back to the original Coke. So you might, if you recall, Coca-Cola back in that time, they had to relaunch their old product by calling it either Classic Coke or Original Coke or something like that. So these are some of the ways in which we have been forecasting new products. It may or may not go well, but focus groups are some ways in which it might help at least to get some insights on what people like or what the market in general likes. And of course, if we are looking at a particular product, whether it is going to replace an earlier existing product, like in case of iPhones, when a new version comes in, it sort of cannibalizes the demand for an older product. So that also helps in trying to figure out what the demand would be for the new product, whether it is similar to an existing product or not. And if we do not know that, we can maybe define certain characteristics of those products and try to categorize it into some of the pre-existing products based on those categories. And there are a lot of algorithms which are good at categorizing products into maybe pre-existing categories. Machine learning has a few good algorithms about categorization, like k-means or clustering algorithms. And once we come up with that general starting point idea of what my product looks like, then we can have a collaborative planning process on top of that to be able to adjust the forecasting. So all of these are traditional ways which are already in place that we use to forecast these new products. And of course, Delphi method is another one where we try to get expert opinion if we don't have enough insights from within the company. So these have been some of the traditional ways in which we have been forecasting new products, and some of the new ways or some of the updates that we would want to suggest in these processes is that there would be some questions that you might want to ask in your process of forecasting new products, like whether this is a limited time offer or not. Are we going to have this product for a longer term or only for a short duration? These types of questions I think we already asked, but some of the questions here that you see, they are much more newer to this social media fancy world. That how does the media spend differ from the last time? What did we do last time when we had similar products, and how are we getting the word out this time? So whatever your company does impact in today's world. So in case of Popeye chicken sandwich, they just had a word out on Twitter, and that kind of created an exchange of tweets among other competitive sandwich chains. So whatever you do in your social media websites or in the world out there now impacts a lot of people at a very high rate. So you have to keep that in mind. How are you getting the word out? How are you positioning yourself in your social media world? And what is the customer sentiment around that presence? So if you have your marketing team get the word out, you have to be aware of what the customer sentiment is around that. And we'll see, we have a tool where we try to capture that social media sentiment and translate that back into how do we forecast going into the future. So as we talked about, when it comes to the process, some of the updates might be to start from where the customers are buying your products from. So we have to make sure we track and use the point of sale data, and then share it back all the way to the suppliers so that they can respond to it more quickly. So for example, you might want to capture the sales data at each of your franchise locations, and then that data may not be as useful to your suppliers, but you should be able to transform that into a forecasting signal so that you can provide that insight to the suppliers, whether the demand is going at a very high rate, whether it's going up or down, and what's the general sentiment around that. And then if possible, if your company introduces a lot of new products, then you might also want to consider having a separate S&OP process for those new products. And you can include your supply team, product team, marketing team, at least at the minimum. And when it comes to new products, sometimes we get into a weekly or monthly cycle when we are doing the S&OP process, that every month we are trying to update the forecast, and the company generally plans through it every month. Maybe it's at the start of the month or at the mid of the month. But that is the idea, that when it comes to new products, to try to avoid getting into that cycle and maybe update the forecast as often as needed. Because in today's world, it takes less than a few days for the demand to spike up, just because the word goes out so quickly because of the social media websites. And specifically for the consumer packaged goods, you have to work pretty closely with your marketing team so that the customer feedback or general sentiment can be incorporated in your forecasting process. And sometimes the marketing is also involved in shaping the demand by getting different sorts of promotions in place. So you have to be aware of that too and incorporate that in your process.
All right, so Abhishek, I just want to quickly jump in here. I have a question for you. So once the calculations for the what if has been done, okay, how can you evaluate the differences and trade-offs across scenarios?
That's a good question. So yes, I will touch upon what if in my next slide. So, but in order to evaluate your different what ifs, there are a few things that you can do certainly. I mean, after you prepare all the possible scenarios, you can maybe evaluate them with some of the key people in your organization to see what's the percentage likelihood of getting into this what if scenario versus the other what if scenario. And then do some quantified analysis or impacts, and you can present that to maybe your management for decision making, because they are the ones who have been longer into the business and they would know what exactly to do in those cases. So in order to evaluate the trade-offs, I would say to evaluate the percentage likelihood and then get insights from somebody who is expert uh, in that field to see what are the different action plans that you can take when a certain scenario like that were to happen. And of course, return on investment is the other one that you can do on different scenarios, whether you want to um, provide customer service at the highest level and at what cost. So those would be some of the trade-offs that you might want to consider. But we'll see it in some of the what if scenarios. We'll see it in the next slide as we go along. Yeah. Okay. So, well, we talked about having a separate S&OP process for new products, right? So when we talk about having a separate S&OP process, the teams that should be part of it is new product introduction team, and have your supply team, demand team, and marketing team at the minimum. So when you start off with introducing a new product, you had a certain assumptions, and when the customer starts to buy your products, there are certain trends that you can keep track of, and then try to validate your previous assumptions against those trends and update them as often as needed. So don't get into a habit of a monthly cycle, but if the trends are increasing or decreasing by a large extent, then you might want to incorporate that as soon as possible. And you would also want to consider the lead times for your product. So how long does it take to get the raw materials from your suppliers, transform it into your product, and get it out to your different franchisees. So in case of Popeye chicken sandwich, it was about 6 to 8 weeks lead time to get the products all the way from suppliers to the stores. So that was also one of the reason why they ran out of their chicken sandwich and could not replenish it on time. They had considered 10% contingency in their supply plan, supplier demand plan, but they did not take into account that social media would go or would shoot up their demand by such a drastic number that they would run out of all of their contingencies that they had planned for. So we are not saying that they did anything wrong. Maybe they did everything fundamentally right. They did think through all the contingencies that they could, but it's just that because of the customer sentiment, the demand just went way over what their contingency plan thought it would go over. So those sorts of scenarios, how do you plan for those, and how do you take into account the customer sentiment when it comes to these sorts of industries which are driven by people's personal taste or preference? So we'll look into that as well. And some of the other things that you might want to consider in the S&OP process is what's your responsiveness to some of the emerging opportunities. So as long as you keep track of your point of sale data and try to analyze it in some way, you would know that which point the demand is growing by the highest amount. And if there is an emerging opportunity in a particular area as compared to other area, and you might want to respond to it in a slightly different way as compared to the overall response. So some things to consider in your S&OP process for new products. And that would bring us to the topic that we want to discuss is what if scenario planning in those cases. So as I already touched upon, you want to make sure that you have a point of sale data signal coming in so that you can track everyday changes and you are able to analyze what happens if this sort of trend continues on a daily basis. Would the demand skyrocket and go or increase by 100% or much more than the contingencies that we have planned for? And what do we do in those cases? And the other question is, how do you track these everyday customer sentiments on social media platforms? So how do you, people have been active on retweeting the things, sharing their personal tastes and things about your company. They have been visiting a lot of websites. So what's the traffic on your website? How many times your company's products have been retweeted or shared? Are the customer sentiment or comments positive, negative, and how do you translate that into demand, right? So those are some of the questions that you would be asking in your company or for your products, and you might want to keep track of those and translate that into demand. So we'll see how we do that in the next few slides as well. But the other thing that you might also want to be keeping track of or doing a what if analysis on is to be able to understand where is the breaking point in your supply chain. So you might want to do some analysis, what if analysis around what if the demand goes up by 3%? And if it goes up by 3%, maybe it's manageable under your current supply chain flexibilities, but maybe when it goes up by 15%, then it becomes not manageable. So if something of this sort was to happen, that the demand goes up by 15%, how do you figure that out? So what are some of the early warning signals that you want to define for your business that would tell you that yes, demand is going in that direction where it will increase by 15%. So have some of those early warning signals that you can think of that you can weave into your what if scenario planning that would also have some action plans against them. So the whole point of doing the what if analysis is to think of all the different contingency scenarios and what would be your action plan if something of that sort were to happen. So in this case, if 15% increase is not manageable, then what are some of the early warning signals? And if you see those signals, what are some of the action plans that you can kick off based on those. So in terms of new products within Arqiva, I want to share some of the things that we do. As we talked about, the traditional way of forecasting new products is to look for similar products in your own product portfolio. So we have a module in place where we, as you can see here in column 1, we have a new product, and in column 3 here we have a product profile. So we have a way in which we specify our new product and are also able to pick what sort of product profile it will follow if there is any pre-existing product. So we are able to pick that up and sort of follow that profile for the new product to begin with. And if we don't have any new product, here you can see we have a separate table where we pick up from some pre-existing models like bars and Gompreds, which are essentially the diffusion model to predict some of the growth rates. If we are not able to figure out from within our own product portfolio how the product forecast would look like, then we can pick up from some of the pre-existing scenarios. And this helps us in creating like a starting point for the new product forecast. But then after that, we need to make sure that we have a good collaboration process in place. So once we go into Arqiva, we will see that on top of the baseline forecast, we would also want to get insights from the product team, from the marketing team. We want to track point of sale data and then come up with a consensus forecast. So as you can see, we have something called workbench where we have historical shipment data coming in. Then we come up with the forecast, which is statistics based. And then we have something called promotion lift. So all of these quantities, essentially, we put them in one place so that we can drive the consensus forecast through this collaborative process where we take into account the sales forecast, point of sale data, as well as the social sentiment index. So this is one of the important things that we have tried to incorporate when it comes to new product, that we sense the general sentiment in the customer platform, in the customer websites, like social sentiment websites, and we drive or come up with an index which will say that, okay, it's been going up, or at least in a month or so, it just went up by quite a lot. So I want to, or I'm anticipating that in the next month, my forecast will go up by quite a lot. Something like that. So have a social sentiment tool. I think in today's world, there are a lot of tools that are available outside in the market, and we would also want to highlight one of the tools that we have how we are coming up with a social sentiment index by scraping different websites. And you can have that index company wide or a specific product wide. So similar sort of index you can look based on your customer sentiment outside in the world, as well as your particular product sentiment outside in the world, and then come up with different scenarios on how are you thinking your forecast would shape going into the future. And so before we get into, well, I want to touch upon some of the coronavirus related what ifs that you can think of. But before we go into this, I want to highlight the social sentiment tool also that we have in place. So I'll just quickly switch over to Arqiva. So as you can see, hopefully the screen refreshed on your end. I want to show you a workbench. So we have a lot of products here. I've just picked one product called AA200, and as you can see, we have different quantities here, starting off with shipment history. And during the collaboration process, we update a lot of other forecasts. So for example, sales forecast, we look at the promotion lift, we look at the statistical forecast, we look at the point of sale and what's the trend for those. And we also look at the customer or sentiment index, essentially derived from the various social media websites. And we tried to update this forecast that, okay, the sentiment has gone up by, I don't know, 8 times. So I might want to increase this as compared to the previous month by maybe 5 times or 10 times or 20 times, something like that. So we can certainly update this number to maybe like something like 80,000. And then eventually in the SNOP meeting that we have, we might want to come up with a consensus forecast by incorporating these different inputs from different people. So that's one point, of course, but where does the sentiment index comes from? So we have a separate module called sentiment analysis. I don't want to go into much detail here, but for example, I have a customer sentiment set up here. So I'm calling it web analysis and sentiment analysis. And I want to look for the terms sandwich, for example, or let's say CHI chicken sandwich, for example. And once I do that, I want to scrape for like 20 different uh, tweets or comments on the website, and I just hit search, and that kind of goes out there with an API and looks on the internet and sees what is the general sentiment. It translates these into a certain index. So if you can see here, it says the spicy chicken sandwich from Popeye is a hit. So that gets a index or score value of 0.98. So generally we score the values from 0 to 1. So it goes, so in this case, it was a good comment. So it gets a higher index as compared to something that's, so for example, this one gets a very low value because of the sad smiley. So all of those comments, we try to rate it in a certain way, and then that score gets translated into one value. And we also look at the how many times a particular comment was shared. So in this example, some of the comments were shared 100 times, 2 times, 3 times, and how many followers are there. So all of that we scrape and we try to convert that into a general market sentiment. And we do that for a lot of other products also. So in this case, there are a lot of products. So for example, Apple iPhone 8 or Apple iPhone 7 and so on. And once we click through that, we see some of the review content, that what is the customer comments or reviews, and we try to convert that into certain sentiment index. So have something of that sort in your supply chain where you are trying to look at general customer sentiment and then translating that into the forecast. And with that, I want to at least get into some sort of what if analysis that you could do for the more recent topic of coronavirus. I don't have too many insights here because this topic is just, I guess, developing, and there have been a lot of disruptions here. But the idea here also remains the same, that the basically you need to have a model ready to be able to evaluate the what ifs. If you never had any sort of what if thinking in your supply chain, then in today's world you are more of like in a reactive mode where you are now trying to adjust to your supply and demand and your manufacturing. But what the point that I was trying to make here is your supply chain is specific to you, and maybe you would know what are the best steps to take. But having a model ready and having some of the pre-generated scenarios. So in this case, example, if your demand goes up by 10% or 50% or 20%, what does it mean for you? So in this case, 20% might mean that you would be okay by running an extra shift, or if it is up by 50%, it might mean for you that you need to buy from competition, right? So essentially, if you would have done all these what if analysis beforehand, then it's more of like which action plan to put in place. So if your demand was 20% high, then now the action plan that you want to put in place is to how do you accommodate into running an extra shift to meet that demand. So those are some of the what if scenarios and the action plans to consider, essentially to, I guess, know where your breaking point is, how much demand you can handle, and based on that, what plan you put in action if you have evaluated some of your what if scenarios beforehand. And if you did not have any of the what if scenarios evaluated, now you are in a reactive mode where you're trying to do whatever best you can based on what you have on your hand. But well, going forward, I mean, we know what's going on right now in the world, but going forward, there could be a lot of other what if scenarios that you might want to analyze, right? Because of the situation that we are at present. So some of the scenarios might be applicable to your business as well. So we know that various countries are not allowing anybody now to come in or go out. So what if this embargo stays for a longer period of time, maybe months? Then what does that mean in your supply chain world or in your business? What's the geopolitical impact of that? What if India or China, they just stop importing or exporting anything from their country? What does that mean? Does that mean it's an end of the globalization? And if that is the case, does that mean that for your supply chain, you need to manufacture everything back in the US or Europe maybe? And since last few years, in terms of supply chain planning, we have been in the mindset of reducing inventory by a whole lot, or going into this mindset of just in time, or having just enough what you need, and replenish as needed, so that you don't have a lot of waste in your supply chain or inventory lying around. And of course, we know that because of the coronavirus impact, a lot of the inventories are running out, and there are not enough products on shelf. Does that mean that this mindset will change? And if so, we plan to have more buffers now in place. So essentially, these are all what if questions again. We might want to plan for, or at least have some action plan in place if this situation extends for a longer period of time, right? I mean, we don't know these situations will happen, or it's possible that everything will calm down in just a couple of weeks and we'll go back to normal. We hope it will, but if it doesn't, that is, we need to have some contingency or some action plan in place. So some of the things that you can think about in terms of what scenarios. And that was pretty much what I wanted to share. I'm sure our marketing team will have much more detailed analysis or webinars and blogs on coronavirus impact and the what if analysis, but these are some of the starting points that we wanted to share. So in summary, what I've been talking about was there are a lot of contingencies that affect your supply chain, and you know your supply chain best, and how the different scenarios or things going on in the world impact you. So think about those and have certain action plan in place if things were to go in a not so obvious way. And in terms of new products, there are certain traditional ways where you look into your own company to come up with the forecasts by looking at similar products. So still continue doing that, at least to come up with a baseline forecast, but be aware of what's going on in the world. Collaborate with the marketing team, because they are the ones who are the first ones to get the word out, and also to keep track of your presence on various social media platforms. So they are the ones who know if the general sentiment is going up or down or negative among the customer. And it's best to get that feedback early on when it comes to new product, because running out of the new product that your customers like a lot is not a good sign. So it's better to be well prepared in those cases, being proactive, and try to update your supply chain plan as much as possible, or as much as you can, and incorporate your suppliers also in those plans if possible, so that you can get the word out through your point of sale data. You can communicate with your suppliers how soon they need to start expanding their production capacities, so that you are able to fulfill the demand from customers. So all of those are at least some starting points where you can build upon your what if scenarios. That what if your demand goes up by a whole lot? What if your supplier does not have enough capacity? Will you be buying from your competition, and so on? And what are the dollar impacts of all of those? And of course, how do you, in the more current situation, what are some of the what if scenarios that you might want to evaluate for the coronavirus pandemic that's going on? So yeah, all of those I just wanted to share to see if that helps anybody. And I guess with that, I want to see if you guys have any questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for walking us through all these wonderful ideas of what if. So I have some questions for you as well. how many types of scenarios should you evaluate, or what should be your deciding factor for what if?
Right. There is no end to the possible what if scenarios, right? But I guess uh, when it comes to supply chain planning, I guess some of the what if scenarios that you should be evaluating is to consider demand and supply. And well, your supply chain, you know it best, right? So you would know where are my bottlenecks, where are some of the contingencies that I should be planning for. I mean, if you are, I don't know, I mean, if you are maybe like a big government contract, it could go to a customer on maybe an east coast, or it might go on to the west coast. So that's uh, another what if scenario where you might want to evaluate, because that adds to the transportation cost, whether purchase order or a government order goes to the east coast or the west coast. And depending on that, you might want to figure out where your warehouses would be located. So, well, it depends on your supply chain, what sort of what if scenarios you want to incorporate, but certainly you would want to evaluate what if the demand goes up by a whole lot in, if you are in the industry, or if you are supply constrained, you might want to evaluate some of the supply related what if scenarios.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay.
So I would also like to encourage others on the call to please start putting in your questions in the questions window, and I would be willing to read them out loud to Abhishek. Whilst I wait on you guys to do that, I also have a question from Nicole, who's one of our attendees. Her question is, how do you capture all scenarios for later accuracy review?
For later accuracy, say that again.
So the question again is, how do you capture all scenarios for later accuracy review?
Right. So how do you capture all your scenarios to be able to evaluate them in terms of forecast accuracy? Is that right? Yeah, that's a good question. So depending on which what if scenario you want to put in place, you have different forecasts in your workbench. So if you recall the workbench that I was sharing, you have various different levels in your collaborative process. So it can be a what if process also, yes, and you would have your what if scenario forecast. So in place of sales forecast, in place of uh, point of sale, in place of consensus forecast, you might also want to add what if scenario 1 forecast, what if scenario 2 forecast. And based on that, because you are capturing those forecasts, you should be able to evaluate your forecast accuracy also, because you are tracking your shipments also. So in our case, and through that workbench, we share or we are able to evaluate what's the accuracy of sales forecast, what's the accuracy of consensus forecast, and we provide that feedback when we go into the SNOP meeting next month, that the sales forecast was more accurate or consensus forecast was more accurate, and we try to update our process based on that. So in terms of what if, you should be able to evaluate by looking at the shipments or comparing shipments with various different what if scenarios, that which what if scenario forecast was more in line with the shipments. So you can certainly share your or look at your accuracy for different what if scenarios.
Got it. And also a follow-up question is, can you store different scenarios?
Yes, we have in our workbench, we can look at different scenarios. So in Arqiva, we have for various different modules, be it demand planning, supply planning, inventory planning, everything is scenario driven. So we have multiple scenarios when it comes to inventory planning. We call them official scenarios, or 10% inventory reduction scenario, or 10% demand increase scenario. So we have these different scenarios, and they can be looked at side by side to be able to compare or see where we are at. So yes.
Got it. So some more questions coming in are, how do you know the range to use for your what if scenarios?
Right. So yeah, as I pointed out, I mean, there is no set rule to see what's the range. The question here becomes, what is the tipping point, I guess, in your supply chain? I mean, going up by 10% or 20%, you might be able to handle that in by adding one more shift, or by buying more from your supplier, or by providing it from the buffer in inventory that you have. But maybe if the demand goes up by 50%, that is where the tipping point is for my company, for example, and I will not be able to handle that with the existing flexibility that I have in my supply chain. So that becomes now a point of another what if scenario that we should incorporate. That what if the demand goes up by such an extent that it reaches a tipping point? What do I do in that cases, or in that case in particular? So at least have a scenario which evaluates your tipping point in your business, in your supply chain. So yeah, certainly you shouldn't, there is no end to the scenarios that you can evaluate, but at least some scenarios which put some strain on your supply chain, or based on current or existing suppliers and production capability, where is your tipping point, and you should certainly incorporate that into your supply chain.
Cool. So,
yeah.
Okay, so we have some time for additional questions, and this question is coming from Elwin. So his question is not necessarily a what if question, but it's in relation to the social sentiment analysis or index. How does it factor into the demand number?
Right, that's a good question. So, well, what we are looking at here is the social sentiment index. Essentially, what is the trend of it? So month over month, day over day, if we are trying to evaluate all the comments, be it positive or negative, and when we come up with an index, whether that general sentiment is going towards the more positive side, or is it going towards a more negative side? And does that mean that if it is going to a more positive sign, does that mean for your business that the demand might go up or down? And if we are able to figure that out, then maybe you might want to still be a little more cautious and don't want to increase your forecast by that much amount. But one thing would be that if the general sentiment is going up, then you might want to increase your forecasts. You don't know if there is a one-to-one relation to it, that if the general customer sentiment increases by 1 point, does that mean that my forecast should also increase by that much? So if the sentiment goes up from 1 to 2, does that mean that it doubles my forecast? Maybe or maybe not. That's yet to be seen. But the general sentiment is that if the sentiment is increasing, that means my demand is going to go up. Now, how much does it go up by? That just varies from business to business. It's not exactly same for food industry. It's not exactly same for fashion industry. It can be different for different industries. But yeah, one general sentiment is that if people have been talking about your products, then the demand would go up. So it's best to be prepared for it.
So to our final question for the day is around statistical forecasting. So is the statistical forecasting taking into account promotions on a specific product, or is rather using time series to forecast based on historical data?
Right. So, well, if it is a new product and if we don't see so many sales, or if we have just launched it, there is nothing much there to use statistical forecast. Statistical forecast just looks at some of the uses some of the algorithms, and it looks at historical sales and tries to generate a pattern based on that. So if we haven't really sold much, there is not much that statistical forecast can do. So it's more of like trying to see which are some of the similar products that follow a same profile, and try to use their historical data set to come up with a forecast using the statistical tool. If we know that this new product is replacing an old product, then we can use the historical data set for that old product onto the new product. Or if we say only 20% of the sales would switch over to the new product, then we can certainly take the statistical forecast and then only consider 20% of that forecast as part of the new product.
Got it. Well, I think this brings us to our questions section because there are no more questions remaining.
Sure.
So I would like to spend this time to tell everyone about our next webinar and also some of our programs that we have here at Akiva. So our next webinar is actually going to be an Akiva user discussion, user exchange discussion, which is where we put together our user group or user base, which is led by customers who present on a particular topic that is really pressing demand planners, or that's really pressing supply chain planners within Akiva ecosphere. And this is where we discuss and share ideas on how to solve some of the problems with the solution. And so the next discussion is going to be on May 2020. So if you're an Akiva user, this is for you, and we'll be sending more information about this later. However, if you're also someone who is interested in learning more about Akiva, we really encourage you to go on akiva.com/webinars. This is where you're going to find all our old or past webinars that have very, very present topics and very educative webinars that can help you and educate you more in the ecosphere of supply chain as well. Next slide, please. So we also encourage you to visit akiva.com/demo. If you're interested in receiving a demo from Akiva from us, you can just put in your information and we'll reach out to you with a personalized demonstration as well. Okay, so that brings us to today's webinar discussion, and we really appreciate your time, and also we look forward to having more meaningful discussions in the future. Thank you all so much for spending time with us. Bye-bye.